Good evening and welcome to today's BIC streams, Data and Old-Fashioned New Journalism, using numbers to tell better story in an attention deficit fake news era. Joining us today are our panelists, Pramit Bhattacharya, Rukmini Srinivasan, John Samuel, and Samar Harlankar. Before I hand over to Samar, just a couple of instructions. For those of you who are here for the first time or don't follow us on our social media channels, you can do that by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also sign up to our mailing list by going to our website. So with that, I hand over to you, Samar, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Raghu, and welcome everyone. I have to first just say that I'm a bit of an interloper here because the other three are certified data journalists. I am not. I still struggle with spreadsheets. That said, I'd like to give you a quick overview before we start talking about this subject. Despite the bloodbath we've seen in the media, hundreds up to thousands, I think, of journalists have lost their job. But India is still one of the world's most vibrant and dynamic media markets. There are still about more than 400 television news channels. There are more than 250 million newspaper readers. And you can still see that despite the slimmed down newspapers, there are still newspapers landing up at your house, many of them if you subscribe to them. But newspapers, of course, are uniquely vulnerable in this COVID era, as the COVID era has revealed. What's happened as these journalists have lost their jobs is that India has been left with ever fewer sources of specialized news than ever before. Indian journalism was never good, I must say, at gauging trends that involve its 1.3 billion people because of the lack of journalists in many fields. For example, agriculture, which still employs about 800 million people, has, I think, normally no more than a handful of reporters. And I think it's in this scenario that we are seeing the rise of data journalists who can discern or interpret trends based on sets of data, large or small, which may or may not be validated on the ground. And let me finally mention, to my mind, data journalism isn't new as a journalistic practice. It may be new as a clearly defined concept. It dates back to what I learned 30 years ago, which is get the facts, get the numbers, get the proof, and avoid comment and opinion. That said, let's jump right into it. And I'd like to begin by trying to illustrate what I mean by discerning trends from large data sets, trends that may not be evident to the normal eye or indeed to most journalists. And I'd like to use that example from one of our panelists, and that's Rukmini. And this is a story that I haven't forgotten, and I think many journalists remember the story from 2014. It was a seminal story in which she explored, I think, the fact that Delhi was categorized as India's rape capital. And she went around looking at data, I think, from 6 or 7 district courts, if I'm not mistaken. Rukmini, you can correct me if I'm wrong anywhere. And she found that all these sexual assaults that had been registered there, first of all, 40% of them, I think about 40% of them involved consensual sex. Basically, it was a question of love. And, I think parents had gone ahead and said that these were, rapes. And I think a quarter of them were breach of promises for marriage or something like that. So I think she gave this wonderful interpretation to what was going on about the rising number of sexual assault cases in Delhi. So that said, let me first begin by asking Rukmini herself and and Pramit and John as well. How did you become a data journalist? Was there a particular point in time that you switched from so-called normal journalism to data journalism? So Rukmini, can we begin with you?
Yes, for me, actually, the shift was quite, for me, the shift was quite specific. I was a reporter in Mumbai and I covered courts and state government and, slum demolitions, all of that stuff. And I did a master's in the UK, and I found that there was all this rich research reports, data about India that I had never used while I was working as a journalist. So when I moved back to India and moved to Delhi, I felt like I wanted to pivot to this sort of reporting. And the Times of India had and still has an excellent team led by Shankar Raghuraman, whose team I joined, and I really learned everything on the job from him then. So the Times of India was the home, my first home for data journalism.
The Times Inside Group, I think you're referring to.
That's right. They still do
Yeah,
great.
and they still do really good work. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. John, how did you drift into data journalism?
So when Mint was launched, Raju Narisetti, the first editor, he hired me and said I had to be in Chennai for 1 year before moving to Delhi. And what I started realizing is that none of the stories from Chennai is getting picked up by the Bombay and the Delhi editions. And so it was the time when a lot of draft red herring prospectus were released. A lot of IPO booms were happening. And these are voluminous 900-page document or 1,000-page document that tells everything about a company. And I said, why don't I look into it? So I have a little bit of background in finance and accounts. So I went through from page 1 to page 900, page 800, and all of this. So by law, you have to disclose everything that you know about the company. So that's the point of the draft red herring prospectus. And it gave a great insight on the functioning of the company, the data that was there, and how it is linked to different components. So that's how I started from the corporate data. Then I moved to Ministry of Corporate Affairs, MCA 21. It was 4 years after it was digitalized. So then I moved from there. I moved to the public data. So it was like Raju Narisetti hiring and telling me to stay in Chennai for 1 year, and not finding my Chennai stories getting published in Delhi and Bombay. I had to find a way to write about Delhi and Bombay companies and draft.
And how did How India Lives come about? How India Lives come about? Tell us a bit about that.
Okay, so Samar, when the first set of census data started releasing, I think in 2012 or 13, what we found out is that a lot of people are reporting on the day 1 and day 2, but you have data for 715,000 geographical locations. Every village has like 600 to 800 data points. Every ward has 600 to 800 data points. So we went about finding out why people are not using public data. And we found 3 reasons. One is that data is in silos. You have census data which won't talk to RBI data because the number of districts don't match. One data will be in scanned PDF, the other will be HTML. And third is that it's very hard to access the data in the way the format is. So we said our simple idea is that why don't we put all the data in one single database, and we will make the data talk to each other so that more number of people can use the data. So that's how the idea of organizing the public data came about.
So John's outfit, How India Lives, I must tell you, has this really interesting India by 750, which is where they've mapped India into in 16 million pieces, if I remember right,
yes,
of information, each 750 square meters, down to 750 square meters, if I remember right from your website.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, Pramit, what was your journey like? I worked with you, of course, before we worked together on quite a few stories, series, etc. And how did your whole journey into data journalism, and now you're a data editor running a very successful data journalism team in Mint. How did that happen?
My journey was actually opposite to that of Rukmini. So my training was in economics at IGIDR, which is the RBI Institute in Bombay. And I had done a lot of data exercises, modeling, etc. as part of my coursework, and I was tired of it. And I thought I'll do journalism and to get away from it all. And I began my career as a market reporter, where I used data, but it was more about talking to people in the stock exchanges, investment banks, and so on. And it was actually my editors, Niranjan, Suku. So after market reporting, I worked, including on that malnutrition project, on feature stories. I did trips to the countryside to report on rural and agrarian issues. Then I had a stint writing editorials. And at that time, I once again began I realized that you can't ignore data, although I'm still skeptical about modeling. I realized that even in normal journalistic reporting, we rely a lot on numbers. And around that time, Sukumar and Niranjan pushed me and Ravi Krishnan, another colleague of mine, to start our own sort of data journalism initiative, Plain Facts. This was around 2013, late 2013. We started in 2014, so there was around 6 months time of preparation. And around the same, I was the most skeptical of all of these people actually, because knowing the standards and quality of Indian data, I was very skeptical that we could produce a regular sort of output that a daily newspaper needs. And at around that time, David Leonhardt of New York Times, whose work we followed, who was an economics commentator, moved out of the edit pages to start the Upshot, which is the New York Times premier data journalism brand now. So that was a sort of vindication that what we were doing was perhaps not wrong. And of course, there were pieces that Rukmini was doing that John had already done. And with all of that, we thought we'll take the plunge and let's see how it goes. But once we started doing it, we got very good response. And then it was after that kind of response and the fact that you could use data to tell a lot of stories you couldn't do otherwise, that convinced me finally to accept myself as a data journalist.
So let me ask all of you a big picture question and think about it a bit. What do you think actually is the relevance of data journalism in a country that's undergoing so much turmoil and change? What can data journalism do, especially in this era when the government has been tending to hide a lot of data? Shall we begin with you, Rukmini, again?
Sorry, you were saying in the context of hiding data that
Yeah, I'm also asking a larger question of the relevance of data journalism in a country that's undergoing so much turmoil and so much change. What can data journalism do if I were to ask you to sell data journalism, so to say, to your ordinary reader? What would you say? And especially in the context of the fact that the government in the last couple of years or more has been hiding a lot of data.
Well, there's two ways you could come at it. First, in terms of the data that is available, you know, there's so much context that still needs to be given, and the response that comes from people when you do data stories is it's really quite moving. I found this very much at the Hindu where I worked, where there was a younger sort of UPSC reading crowd that was so hungry for data. And I don't just mean this in the very prosaic sort of because it'll be helpful for the UPSC sort of way. It really was something that they sought from their news. And I think, Pramit will back me up on this, which is that I think his page, Plain Facts, is and the pieces in it are regularly among the most read on Mint's website. So fighting for attention in an attention deficit world is not something that I actually worry for data journalism. I think it gets attention quite easily. I don't actually find that something that I have to fight for space for. And in times of turmoil, I mean, even more so, I suppose there's two things we look for. We look for stories, and I look for stories, and I look for numbers to help me think through times of great turmoil. And no greater example than what we're going through right now. And the things that have stayed with me most would be, in some cases, very moving stories. For example, Supriya Sharma, the editor of Scroll, among all the journalism she did, one of the people was just talking to a young 17-year-old boy named Shivam on the Taj Expressway as he was cycling home. And just little bits of the story, it wasn't even in sort of, if you want to break it down into things, it wasn't the most heart-rending migrant story even. Maybe it was in the way she told it, just that moment that really stuck with me. So I would imagine for readers as well, these great stories and data is what they're looking for, to hold on to make sense of things, to plan ahead, to assess their own risks in times of turmoil like this. In terms of hiding data, again, I feel like this is probably something John and Pramit and I might disagree on the levels of it. My sense has been that in the kinds of data I use, especially, which would be demographic and socio-economic, much more than financial, which John and Ramita are more familiar with. The problem so far has not largely been that of hiding data. I know that has happened in a couple of instances, rather sitting on it. And they might hide the data, but we have so much to pull it out. So it's still journalism that got us out of that hole. My concern is less about hiding data. Again, if we talk about it in this context right now, of course, there's concerns about some of the health data that's being hidden. But my problem is also just how low the bar has been set for open data in India, that the fact that this country that's contributing so much to the overall pandemic can get away with just putting out all India state-wise numbers for today only, with nothing running backwards, and that all of the world's media and researchers have to depend on a crowdsourced website, covid19india.org, run by volunteers who seek no money, no credit at all, is a huge shame. And I'm not comparing us with the US or with European websites. For work, I have to go through Latin American countries' COVID websites every day, and they blow me away in the level of detail that they're giving. So I suppose my problem is the low bar that we've set in terms of what it's acceptable for the government to give out, even when it's not something that they're necessarily hiding.
Ramit, why do you think that is? Why you've written substantially on government hiding kinds of data? You've gone and investigated this data. I remember many of your stories. Why do you think we are dealing with the situation that Rukmini spoke about just now?
So much of it, if I were to sum up in one word, is it's just a petty bureaucratic tangle. More than anything else. That's how I would think it. And one of the sort of negative aspects, if I may say so, of a metric-driven society is that today both officials and politicians are held up to account for the numbers they deliver, be they on growth, jobs, health, etc., much more than say 10, 15 years ago. This is also why numbers are more important. Data journalism is being followed more. But the flip side is that it has also become more political, and that is natural in a democracy. But that also creates perverse incentives. Those incentives are always there. It's just that now they have gone beyond a certain threshold, and which leads to much more tighter. So there are two different kinds of movement. One is this movement towards opening up, digitizing databases and so on. You have those flashy dashboards for every ministry and so on. And the other is that the moment, there is a perception that this is being used to done something quote unquote negative, then there is an attempt to clamp down. And so I think we are still in the middle of this, and I don't know what the final outcome will be. They are both positive and negative. We can talk more about this in the Q&A session. But just to sidetrack a bit from this and to get back to the data journalism question itself, I think one of the reasons that we continued doing what we did, expanded it into a full page, and which is the only daily page dedicated to data journalism. But now I see other newspapers also attempting to do this, is because the readership has changed, and newspapers, websites, everyone realizes that the old sort of clickbait model doesn't work even in a digital environment. The old this thing of we telling you what to think also has its limits, and telling readers that this is what we have collected and giving them the data transparently to a young audience, to a more educated audience compared to say 10, 15 years ago, is also a more prudent sort of strategy. So I'm not saying that everyone in the audience is numerate or is able to make, but the number of people, the sheer number in terms of absolute numbers of people who can understand the nuance in a story, who can understand numbers in a story today is much more than what it was 20, 30 years ago. That's just because of the rate at which our education levels have gone up. And the young audience is because of the changing demographics of the country. And that generation is not afraid to question even a very prestigious or award-winning journalist on Twitter, and in a very aggressive manner on where you got this number from, why did you write this 3 months ago, and so on. So there is a negative side to it, but there is also a positive side to this entire social media accountability, and that I think has done the entire world a whole lot of good. Today in editorial meetings, an editor can raise this question that how will this story be seen 3 months down the line. And raising this question in newspaper, which earlier was thought of as having shelf life of just a day, was not so common earlier. But now you know that many more people will read you on the website, on the internet, than physically. So even for a newspaper, that becomes important. And I think it is all of this together that has given data journalism the place that it has today in the Indian media. And it is also all these factors that are driving the greater use of data in policy and in politics. I mean, who would have thought that a prime minister in his election campaign will use a PowerPoint presentation with graphs and charts? This is not to say that, some people will say that, okay, this is because of such certain personality or certain this thing. I think there are deeper demographic and structural factors which have led to this. Now, how we write this out, whether this leads to a clamp down on data, whether this leads to more rigorous checks and balances, we are I think still in the midst of those institutional changes, and we are yet to sort of arrive at a more mature sort of handling of public data. That's my sense.
But we have seen some of those clampdowns clearly,
Yes,
haven't we
yes,
not?
Yes.
Yeah, we have. So it's interesting what you said about social media and how people react on social media to a lot of data journalism, because I think social media perhaps is in that sense made for data journalism, put up little charts, graphs, etc. So John, what has your experience been, apart from the overall relevance question that I'd like you to address? How do you believe that social media has been interacting with data journalism? And Pramit talked about young people who question you a lot, but a lot of those young people or older people, in fact, well, older people, younger people, I don't think we should make a distinction there. India is the largest, also the largest market for WhatsApp in India, in the world. All the attendant fake news that flows out of WhatsApp. So how do you reconcile these issues?
Samar, like what Pramit said, there are positives and negatives. In terms of your reach of your story, right? Whether newspapers can make the economics work in terms of the online world, I'm not sure, whether they have figured it out. But in terms of the sheer number of people who could read your story almost immediately has definitely gone up thanks to social media. And the number of people who were commenting on it also has improved a lot. Like for example, imagine when I started my career in 2000, it's in a paper mode, no social media, and those 200,000 readers or 500,000 circulation, not even sure how many among the 5 lakh people would have read my story. So there is no feedback into the story. So in that way, I see it as a huge positive, wherein what we do, like some of the stories that Pramit's team does, or Rukmani's stories, they get repeated a lot, and a lot of conversations happen around it. I have very negligible social media presence, only because I find it hard to manage the time in engaging in the social media. So as an individual, I focus on the work. So I'd taken a call not to focus on social media, but because I feel that the conversations around on the personal, spending time and the reward in the social media was not great. But in terms of your stories, what you do, and the reach that it gives, and the feedback that one can get for your stories, I feel that's a huge positive. Today, Pramit can write a plain fact story, and somebody in US almost immediately, the right person will be able to pick up that story. If it's spread to the right person. That was highly difficult 15, 20 years back. So I feel that conversation that's happening because of that is highly enriching, and that's a positive. But personally, for me, I feel that investing time in the social media, I tend to keep it as a low priority.
I think all of you referred very briefly to the elephant in the room, fake news. And I think Rukmini would like to clearly has something to say on this. She mentioned this to me earlier, even before we began this. And she believes that data necessarily does not fight fake news. Rukmini, I'll let you have your say.
Yes, sorry, I didn't even realize I had such strong thoughts about it, but clearly I do. I have not found evidence, whether hard evidence or even anecdotal, in the fact that that data changes minds. It seems to me that just as we stick to seeing and believing the news, anecdotal, that suits our political preferences, the same works for data as well. Just one example: after the 2011 religion census data figures came out, I thought I did some, very groundbreaking journalism by the Home Ministry, of course, only put out figures for 2011 and some comparisons for 2001. And what I did is I went back and looked at all the past numbers, and what it showed is, so while the headline statistics were that the population growth of Muslims was far higher than that of Hindus, if you looked at the overall sort of demographic story over time, the real story was that Muslim population growth was slowing. It was slowing faster than had been anticipated by demographers. It was slowing faster than the growth rate was among Hindus. So to me, this felt like something that should change minds. But I can guarantee you that among people who believe that Muslim population growth is very fast, is unrelated to education and women's health as it is, these facts will not have percolated at all. On so many, and I feel like I should recognize this in myself as well. My own political biases, I don't even know if they're political, my own biases about the things that I hold true or just or real or valuable. I'm not entirely sure that if I saw something data-based, especially in a publication that I don't usually agree with, if that alone would change my mind. So I feel like information comes bundled with so many other things. Data is one part of it. And uh, I don't know. I feel like, I know that sometimes people, when I write something, even my parents, they might they get excited about it and they say, okay, you know what, I'm going to share this article with my WhatsApp group and this is going to change all of this. I don't think it actually works. I don't think your RWA or your extended family group is going to get their minds changed by my data story at all. I wish I had those powers, but I just don't think I do.
I was going to say to all of you that, to my mind, data can demolish claims made by the propagators of fake news. But I was wondering, in the end, does it matter? Because as you said, I agree with you that people tend to stick to their biases. But my question to you, Pramit and John, then in that case is, do you agree with all of this? And how many uncommitted people you think are out there willing to accept the kind of dispassionate data that you put out?
Okay, can I go first?
Because yes, please.
I would partly agree with Rukmini, but I also have disagreements. So I do think it is possible to convince people, and there is a huge middle ground out there which is not committed either way on either economic issues, left versus right, or on political issues, again, left versus right. And it is that middle ground with which we engage, and they may vote differently at different times and so on. And of course, Rukmini knows more about voting data than I do, but even in voting data, you do see that there is a huge constituency of swing voters. So if you apply a similar analogy in readership, I think it is much more likely that a swing reader is able to encounter views that he doesn't believe in today's world of excessive information and social media, then in the past when and there is some new research on this which actually contests the entire idea of social media bubbles, and they say that actually despite social media bubbles, people with social media presence are more likely to engage or see contrasting views, and the original research of that, you know, blue feed, red feed on Facebook was flawed. So I think that is the backdrop of this. But the other thing, and which ties into what you were asking earlier about hiding data and government propagation of information, because the government is one of the dominant channels that provide us information and data. So there, I won't say fake news, but I would say bending the truth and trying to cover up the truth is something that they do, even when they don't hide the data, or even when they're forced to release the data. So just to take the example of that jobs report, the PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey report, which we got to know the headline numbers initially only because of, as Rukmini mentioned, Somesh Jha's investigation. If you remember at that time, the senior officials, including those from the Niti Aayog, were not questioning the findings. They were questioning the methodology. They were questioning the intentions of those who had commissioned the survey. They were questioning the procedures that went on before the survey was commissioned. And on all of this, they were peddling fake news, essentially, because the survey was commissioned by the National Statistical Commission, of which the Niti Aayog members were also members. It is another matter that they didn't take any interest in those meetings, didn't even attend those. But if you go, and it's a public document, if you go and download the annual report of the National Statistical Commission, you will find the signatures of those Niti Aayog officials. I don't even have to name them. You can go and see for yourself. And all the details of those survey, including the periodic labor force survey, are there. So all the objections that they raised in their op-eds and so on in the press conferences, they had actually signed on those. So when they wrote those op-eds, they were actually peddling fake news. So just to give a simple example, for instance, there is the question of why was there no proportionate sampling? Why there was oversampling of urban educated people? Now this is either you're completely statistically uninformed, or you're peddling fake news. Because I spoke to a lot of people on this, and everyone said that historically the criticism against the employment surveys was that, look, you may be capturing the rural areas correctly, but on urban areas, especially richer households, educated households, you're not able to capture the trends. Hence, there is a problem. This is a standard critique, and I checked in EPW, in other journals. This is what the literature on labor market surveys says. So this was a problem that the labor statisticians, official statisticians acknowledged, and hence corrected it. And all those discussions were part of the NSC meetings. So then to go around and say that, look, they changed the methodology to show something and cast the government in a bad light was problematic. And the reason many neutral, independent economists or statisticians did not jump into the debate was it happened just before the election. So they didn't want to see defending the previous regime, or so these guys got a free run almost, and now once all the storm has subsided, you see that the PMSC is commissioning reports from other economists who are using the PLFS data as it stands without a single caveat. And the day the government comes in, the PLFS report is released. Within a month, the raw data is put up on the website. Again, with one small line in the intro saying caveat, but they put all the comparison tables, everything. So
so essentially, they're going to be using the same data that they were at pains to demolish earlier.
Yes, they have already used it. That's what I'm saying. Even in PMS. So it's not just the hiding of the data that is problematic. It is all the spin and the narratives around that is most problematic.
Data lies in the eyes of the beholder in that sense. John, I'll let you have your say on this before we move on to some substantive questions.
So I swing between both extremes. Sometimes I believe that what we do will change people's mind, and then you realize that after almost within a day you swing to the other side. Nothing changes despite all your hard work and your data that you put in. But then one of my friend Ramnath used to say that the market for serious journalism was always a small portion. If you look at me, it was not small now, it was small even before. So And but I believe that this particular market is not a huge market, where people are looking at serious journalism. The work that ProPublica does in US, I'm not sure that lot many people will read that story, every story that comes out. So in a way that the ideal scenario is that you hope to make a small change at the margin with your stories, and then push the envelope of information that is available in the public domain, and just hope that this will bring about a change. So that's my the positive side, like when I'm looking at it. The other side is that there's so much of noise on irrelevant stuff, like people arguing and tweeting, sharing on stories that don't matter. But when it comes to really good investigative, where the journalists have spent a lot of time to put together the story, not just data story, not many people will read and share about it. But my comfort is that the market for serious journalism is small, and that market is essential because that is the market that pushes the envelope at every time. Asks for new information, puts out the new information, and argues that hey, this data is counter to the popular narrative. Why don't you look at it? And I think we should never give it up, although the number of people who are doing it is coming down, but that number should not go down further.
So I think this is a good launching pad to discuss some basic questions on the extraction of data, the reliability of data, and how you validate a lot of the data available in India. I'm also saying this because I had these questions of all of you all, but there are also a lot of questions coming in which are precisely around these issues. I'll just run through 2-3 of them very quickly. Madhusudan asks you any experience in extracting primary data, accessing government departments by flying RTIs. I think that's a different matter. But in situations where there's a discrepancy in figures available or limited data available on a theme a data journalist working on, what would be the best approach? There are a couple of questions that talk about large data exercises like the census often comes years after enumeration. Does this impact the newsworthiness of these tranches of data, considering much has changed in a city, state, or country between 2011, using the census as an example, and 2015-16 when data are released? There is the lack of open data. Are we culturally driven by eminence-based analysis as opposed to evidence-based analysis? Could this be the real challenge? To put all of these together, I'd like you all to refer a bit to the challenges of extracting data in India, how to confirm the validity of that data, and then matching quantitative and qualitative work against each other. Rukmini, would you like to start off?
Yeah, so in some ways, I feel like I am a cautionary tale about old data journalism and the need for better skills than mine. I have no tech skills, and these it's not a humble brag. It really is something that would have improved my journalism when I worked in broader. I work independently now, but when I worked in broader teams and newsrooms, I greatly benefited from working with either a developer or a journalist who could also code. So, one good example of someone both Pramit and I have worked with is a young journalist whose name is Samet Bansal. He also works independently now. He's doing some stories for HuffPost. He has a great combination of now being a good journalist who's gone out there and reported on the field, but also with good tech skills to be able to extract, clean, use data well. So, let me give you the example of the Delhi sexual assault trials case that we talked about earlier. In many ways, it is when I tell people about how I went about it, there's great incredulousness, mainly because it seems like the slowest and most as slowest and dumbest possible way of getting to the data, but I read every judgment for 1 year in every district court manually. I had the tabs open and I just kept doing it as I could for 6 months. So in some ways,
This
now
was
that
in
I
physical form. Was this in physical form?
at least Delhi had it all digitized, and then when there were extra documents that I needed, I had to go to courts for that. So now that I know what I know about what exists in terms of tech, in some ways I feel like it can be done differently now, and I know people use these tools. But also when I talk to people, and Bangalore has a bunch of organizations doing great work with legal data, but despite having every tech tool at their disposal, in some ways they run up against the same problems that I ran up against while just reading judgments physically, which is that the lack of data standardization, and this applies to all fields, but I'm sure anyone who works in legal data would particularly agree with this, because legal data is really, I think, probably in the biggest mess of any large data field that exists in India. The lack of standardization means that most scraping or sort of machine learning tools really fall short there, and you'll end up filling a lot of it by really reading things manually. So when I spoke about what I feel about the importance of combining qualitative and quantitative data, in some ways, if a system existed of being somewhere in the middle of machine learning and what I did, that's what I would have felt would have been an ideal tool then. And I feel that about many aspects of data journalism, which is to be able to combine. It's ridiculous to spend this much time as I did on that. Journalists shouldn't be spending that much time on on extracting. So you need the tools for that, but you need your qualitative knowledge either from domain experts, by just speaking to them, or from having been a court reporter or a crime reporter, to fill in the blanks with what you're missing because of all of these gaps that exist in the data, which machine learning can't get past. So there are good tools. I'm excited for people who can use more of that. It's great to combine skills. So if you don't have it, it's great to have combined newsroom teams for that.
John, I'll just come to you because there's also a question for you, which is what has been the biggest challenge for you in finding a meaningful interpretation of all the data that has been collected so painstakingly? So I think this again has to do with the whole question of getting data and interpreting it.
Sure. So Samar, the biggest pain in working with lots of data, right? It's a completeness. You get the data for 542 districts. I'm just making up the number, and then remaining 98 will not have the data. They would not have put it out, or they would have missed filing for 1 year, and their gap would be 2 years back. How do you rank? How do you compare cities and all of it? So this is the biggest pain point we have come across in this thing. Like the lack of completeness. No data set is complete. Even the health data sets, there are certain data sets we know that in certain areas are pretty bad. We know that crisis 60 kids have died of JP, but the data that's updated on the fortnight will have 0 deaths with JP. So that's the completeness is like a biggest thing. The second thing is that you actually see a new data source and you're happy that this data is there, and you'd have extracted the data and then try to analyze it for a month or so, and one fine day it just vanishes. Recently, I think a lot of people discussed in Data Meet. There's a Google Meet, I know, where a lot of data guys get together. So the National Highways Authority put out the toll data, like how many trucks pass through each of the tolls. And it so happened when the lockdown happened, I think 1 week before that or 1 week after that, this data was released. No, not in an official way, but somehow, we found out, and then our idea was to scrape it for a month or two to see whether the traffic is happening or not. I think after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, the site went down. Imagine if that data portal was alive. And today, I think somebody reported, saying that the traffic was 95% before the pre-lockdown. Nobody knows whether the data is true or not. It's a government putting out the number. And yes, sorry.
So where did it go?
So
Was it
they make it login. You have to log in to access it. So then they say that the access is only for NHA officials. The same happened with the National Disaster Management Agency. They were putting out a map-based data, and we were scraping the data on a daily basis. Every day we got data on for even if a district has one case of COVID, we could find out how many were tested, how many were quarantined, how many hospital beds were there. Till May 1st, the data was coming out. So we wanted to see the data getting stabilized to find out, what's happening. And suddenly the NDMAs decided, oh, this data is not for public use. It's only for internal use. They put out the login, this thing, and we no longer could scrape the data. So I think May 1st week is the last date in which, we got all the data. Amazing data, every district had at least 40, 50 data points. How many PPEs, how many N95 masks, how many ventilators, how many beds, every data was there. And they just shut it out. Why can't it be in the public domain? So this, the first is the completeness. That's a real pain, whenever you're trying to do an analysis. The second is that good data sources are shut down, where it's a given in other countries, but in our country, a lot of good data sources are shut down for no reasons.
Ramit, what has been your experience? Why do you think these data sources keep getting shut down? Were these because of the reasons you referred to previously?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would think those applies in this case as well. And this is also one of the reasons why in the COVID tracker we started in March, and right from that time itself we tried to have different levels of data, country, state, district, and from different sources. We knew one or two of these sources will not be there a few months down the line, or even a few weeks down the line if cases went up too much. So we started with that anticipation, and it turned out to be, or with that fear. It's unfortunate, but that is the reality. So that is one challenge. The other challenge is actually the data, when the data is there, but it doesn't match, or there are glaring inconsistencies. Sometimes because, as John said, it is incomplete and you don't know how to match it. But sometimes even when it is complete, then it doesn't tally with what other databases are telling you. And this has been a large problem for the macroeconomy as a whole. Arvind Subramaniam wrote a couple of papers on this, that how the GDP data doesn't match what many of the high frequency indicators tell you about the state of the economy for the past several years. There have been others in the private sector who have made the same point. And there, I think, we at PlainFacts, what we have tried to do is that we try to rely on a broad variety, or a broader sort of, we never rely on one particular indicator. So we have a macro tracker where we track 16 indicators each month. Yeah. And then we try to come up with a combined metric. We have a similar thing for emerging markets to see how India compares. So that is one approach. It's not the ideal sort of this thing. And these, and we are also now using more different kind of indicators, such as the Google mobility data and so on, to make sense of how the unlocking is happening and so on. But all of this put together cannot replace your, standard official GDP or factory output numbers. The problems with those remain, and those we have been writing about it, and part of our work. And I think those stories actually take much more time. I don't think everyone in the audience or every reader actually appreciates those stories. But for us as a team and for us as journalists, I think it is very important to pursue those stories on data quality, on the gaps that still exist, and on what are the potential sort of ways in which those could be improved or filled.
There's a related question which you had also referred to earlier. This coming from someone in the audience, Dipankar. How do we know which data to believe? With the same data coming with wide variation from many sources. This is like GDP, government, World Bank, CMI. You referred to this yesterday in a story that you wrote about unemployment and the problem, the fact that CMI data was showing something else and the government data was showing something else. How do you reconcile this?
So yeah, so sometimes we also have to write about these things, point out the gaps, even when we don't have the final answer. So on the jobs issue, CMI versus PLFS, we don't have the final answer. We didn't give a final answer. But at the same time, I thought this was very important because increasingly a lot of people, both on the private sector side, banking sector economists, also on the academic side, a lot of researchers were using CMI data simply because there's no other high frequency jobs data. And the PLFS data was supposed to be real-time data, but again, for the reasons we discussed, it has become a sort of annual affair. They release after 4 or 5 quarters. So it really is of no use because this is supposed to be a high frequency survey only of the urban areas. It is supposed to feed into real-time economic policy making. It is not happening. But even with the past data, so for the 2018 to 19 period, we had a set of 4 or 5 comparable quarters for which we had both CMI and PLFS data. And there we found that states which saw sharp spikes according to PLFS, according to CMI, they were among the ones that were in the sort of bottom quartile as far as spikes were concerned. They in fact saw highest drop in unemployment. And even at the national level, the trends were not similar, and especially for the female workers. And now anyone familiar with this also knows that, India is among the lowest female labor force participation, very few women workers, and this has been true for the past decade or so. And our official count shows that there are much fewer women workers compared to male workers. But CMI's data shows even lower proportion of female workers compared to male workers. A part of this is because of definitional issues, because reference period for the PLFS is 1 week versus 1 day for CMI. There are also other design issues, but part of the problem also lies in the fact that we don't have the full details of the CMI black box because it's a paid sort of software. Although it is being widely used, it is not a public body, it is a private body, and they incur a lot of costs in doing the survey. So it is quite natural that they're taking a price for it. But we are going to increasingly face this problem in the coming future. That's my sense, because given the lag with which public officials are releasing data, people are going to increasingly turn to private sources, even for things that the public authorities should provide. And there it is going to be even more difficult to judge and ascertain the quality and validate that data with other sort of this thing.
So that I think. Sorry, go ahead.
To sum up, I think one of the underappreciated tasks of a data journalist is simply reading, whether that be reading documentation, reading the footnotes, or reading associated research. So a lot of our time goes into that. And that is what I think gives us the confidence whenever we finally do a story that, okay, we have got this right.
In fact, there's someone has a question, Anushka Pandit, saying that we've noticed how all of you have worked in the field, and the journalism before becoming data journalists. Do you think this pattern of first being a reporter and then specializing can change or has changed?
It has changed. So in PlainFacts, for instance, most of my current recruits don't have, so 2/3 of them don't have prior reporting experience, because 1/3 anyway have a developer kind of role. They also do other things, but their background is that they have journalism training. So they have done some journalism courses, but they don't have any field reporting experience. Some have sort of economic research kind of background, and some have done some reporting. So it's a mix. And given the fact that a data journalism job requires so many different skill sets. Initially, when we started PlainFacts, we thought that we'll get this ideal data journalist, 2-3 such people, and we'll run the team. But then we realized it's not possible. You need the team to have everything, but you can't have the same person equally adept at everything. Even a developer should have some reporting experience, even if not experienced, he should be willing to speak to people, go out in the field and talk to people. And we encourage them to do so, and they do. So
even So even within this specialization, you are now requiring specialists.
Yes, yes,
Correct?
there are subspecialists. Yes.
Okay, John and Rukmini, I wanted to quickly address the related issue because a lot of questions coming in on this. Sunil Prabhakar is asking, John, do you think such data available with government agencies is reliable? A lot of people are asking that. Abhinay is saying that most of the data-driven stories are based on government data. And what are the other sources we can go to get data? So how dependent are you on government data, and what are the other sources that you can go to?
Shall I go first?
Yes, please.
Sure. So just to the last 1 or 2 months, this is a live example, so I will share it. So we were trying to see, trying to compile district GDP. They call it as district domestic product for all the districts in India. So this another question, nobody knows how many districts are there in India. You ask a census, they'll tell you one number, and you ask RBI, they tell you another number. But whatever be it, we took a grand experiment to say, let's go to statistics department of all the state governments and compile all the district domestic product, district GDP numbers. 9 big states just don't have it, including Gujarat. The basic number for any city level planning is a district domestic product. So we got so frustrated with the whole of it. So my colleague Avinash Celestin, I proposed to him, hey, this is how district GDP is being estimated, and we know that we can have access to this data, and we also have additional sets of data that go into the district GDP. Why not we create it? A data analytics company called Indicus, now acquired by a market research company, used to have this. Right now, I'm not sure whether that district GDP product is available or not. So we took a call that, yes, government data is not there. What is there is not reliable. Why don't we put our resources and build the same? I think we'll have to move towards that, wherein, we build capabilities, like what Pramit said, have the 15 or 20 set of trackers, and to give an idea of how the economy is performing on a monthly basis. I think we have to marshal our data skills, tech skills, and our understanding of the whole thing. And the more important skill is the storytelling skills. A lot of tech companies are there, a lot of data companies are there. What is unique to journalists is that their ability to tell stories out of this. I feel that the way forward is to generate our own data sets, out of data that is available to us, and construct proxies, indicators, numbers that will free us from this reliance on data. And no way we'll be independent of government data. They are so big. TLFS, correct me, Ramit, it's 6 lakh households, right? The survey base. It's no way that anybody could do that at that scale. Nobody can do that on a consistent basis on
NFHS is 6 lakhs. PLFS is 1 point something.
1 point, sorry about it. So I feel that I personally, from how India lives, we really want to make this effort, especially in the COVID times, to marshal data from multiple data sources and build our own data sets. And then that can actually track the economy and the economic activities and other parameters, socioeconomic parameters, much more accurate manner.
Yeah, I mean, this particular aspect, Rukmini, I'd like you to address and add on this fact. You referred to it briefly, but Prabhakar in our audience is also asking, are the initiatives to crowdsource data and aggregate them? And would you consider them reliable? And we certainly have that right here in Bangalore. There's a group sitting and counting migrant deaths. And last I saw there were 800, not related to COVID, but a lot of other things in transport accidents, in alcoholism, all kinds of things. So Rukmini, can you just address these issues?
So I think I'm a bit more of a skeptic on using non-government sources than Pramit and John perhaps. There are some large private sources that have established themselves as good enough to use, with a combination of having a large sample size, asking truly useful questions, because between them, our large national official sample surveys don't ask a lot of questions that a lot of us would like answered. So, for example, I think the India Human Development Survey has really sort of established itself as both methodologically reliable, large, and asking questions that we actually want the answers to. Of course, it has to be caveated by the fact that in many state samples are too small for you to be able to say anything useful about it. Um, uh, Sorry, what was the second part, Samar?
The question of crowdsourced data, how reliable are these?
So actually, this is something I'm particularly a skeptic on, and I think in this particular crowd, it might be a slightly controversial thing to say, but I'm not a big fan of newspaper or media-based databases, just because of how poorly the media covers so many things. Hacks it to an FIR, and then what crime reporters do to an FIR in many situations, and what makes it to the newspaper. That being your building block for a database is a terrifying thought to me. Every possible push and pull of society operates at the police station and at the newsroom level, in both recording an FIR and in a crime report making it out. So, I'm not happy about that. So for that reason, I'm not happy about crime reports. And also, I do not think that converting regular journalists into chroniclers or records and crime. I don't think it's a reasonable direction to go in. So it's definitely a great, it's a valuable resource, and it's something I would look at and maybe build on. But I would not use a media report based database solely just because I've seen the cogs, and those cogs are not pretty. So I wouldn't be happy using it.
Since you're a skeptic, and since you said that, Ankit Singh in our audience is saying that when big data is freely available in a few years, decades, will we all be data journalists, like we're all photographers with phones today, or will we always have to rely on someone else's analysis, like people like all of you?
So if I can just jump in, I think what John says is, and I felt like, I think this is something I didn't value or didn't agree with as much earlier, but more and more I see the value of stories. In some ways, it's the most human of instincts. It's what a child wants, to be told a story, and it's the form in which. And I don't see it as a dumbing down or as turning information into something palatable at all. It's just it's making sense of things within the world that exists. So no, I think all of us who have tried to get developers to write stories will know that it's not the same as data journalism. It's not about a storytelling ability. It's about seeing. I'm using the word story, but I'm not even sure that's the word I'm looking for. Seeing sense in it is not a universal feature. It doesn't have to be the preserve of journalists, but it's not something that everyone with a spreadsheet will do either.
So there will always be, as you're saying, interpreters like you.
I don't know whether they'll be like me. And I think different people want different things. There'll definitely be people who, frequently there'll be people who will say, put out all your information in a big spreadsheet. I want the information. And there'll equally be people saying, do not give me open data. I need to be told where the story is.
Right.
Don't give me a graph without a caption. I can't make sense of it. So I think, what people like Pramit and John are able to do is do a combination of the two, put out some of the back end for the people seeking that, and tell the story of what they see in it. So there's jobs for people like me and not like me.
So context, that brings me to Pramit and John, the question of context and storytelling. So one, of course, is you're dealing with these huge data sets, lots of numbers. Obviously, it's incumbent to provide context. How do you do that? Provide context. B, the second thing is that I personally don't see all that much about data journalism in India is the question of creating narratives. Data finally, to my mind, represent people. So are we doing enough of that, connecting the data and the context that you put it in and connecting it with people's lives? Pramit, will you go first?
Yeah, so if I understood correctly, you were saying whether we do enough of narratives in data journalism?
Yeah, narratives of in data journalism, and do you connect people's lives, the people who are represented by your data? Do you bring those out as well? Because a lot of data journalism in India, and not really criticism, is only an observation, does a marvelous job of providing context and analyzing these numbers. But where are the people who represent these numbers in many of your stories?
Yeah, so that's a fair criticism that we may not be able to do that for each story. But having said that, for the stories that we do at Mint, many of them on the economy, it is about different economic actors, and we do all of those. So whether it be from the government or on the private sector, there is a lot of reporting that goes into each of the story. So unlike what we used to do when we were doing a reported piece where you put 3-4 quotes of who said what and this thing.
Yeah.
So we won't quote those many people. So a lot of
Yeah.
people think sometimes we don't put even a single quote, but
Yeah.
for that story
True.
we may have spoken to 12 people, and this is something I tell people when they join my team itself, that look, you have to speak to people. I don't
Yeah.
care whether you quote them finally or not, but you have to send me the quotes. When you file your
Yeah.
story, you have to send me the list of people and what they have said. So that is a drill that is instilled, and they do that, and they do that happily, and it lifts our stories. We use quotes very selectively also because of word space constraints, because a lot of our stories we put in at least 1 or 2 paragraphs on the methodology. If you're creating an index, we explain it and so on. So that takes up. So that naturally leaves very little space for putting big quotes. But I do think that speaking to people is very, very important. And for almost all of our stories, we do it and we benefit from it. So, and narrative, yes, definitely it is very, very important. In fact, we did a series on district level. As John was mentioning, we don't have enough district level information on either demographics or wealth or household amenities or even access to tap water, toilets, etc. So when the NFHS came out, although it was a health survey, it has, because it has such a large sample, like more than 500,000 households, that we thought it was a good, and it was representative at the district level. We will do a district level mapping of all of this. And we also, along with John's team, developed an interactive based on that allowed you to see and go into each district, click on it, and see which districts has what and so on. And that series went on for 4-5 days. But when we got response, including emails that were sent to us, people focus much more on the narrative. For instance, the first story we showed that if you took an imaginary line across the map of India, then most of your well-off districts lay to the west of the line, and most of your poorer districts lay to the east. So say from Kanpur West onwards and Kanpur East, that kind of a thing. And it shows very clearly in the map. And the entire story was about that. But there was also an interactive online, and a lot of people read it online. But when they wrote to us, they talked about the narrative and what they thought about it, where they were from, and how they or their travels through this region and so on. So I think to connect with the readers, of course, interactive will give to say a section of the reader, that is the most important thing. But for many readers, it is the narrative, and you have to tell them, and then you give them the data. So we also put it up on GitHub for those who wanted to access, because we scraped it and we spent on this particular series, we spent a few months. I mean, not exclusively on this, but we spent a few months from conceptualizing to finally delivering. So we thought we should put it out for those who didn't have the time. And a lot of private sector people were also, because we also put out bikes, how many districts, which districts have more bikes, more cars, and so on. So they were interested. So we put out all that in the GitHub file for those who were interested. But for many readers, I thought it was the narrative that, so even if you, so which is also why I think going forward, you may not see many many large, grand interactives even in the digital space. You will see functional interactives. You will see many more narratives, and hopefully, what you said, and what we are missing much more is a combination of traditional sort of featuristic sort of this thing reporting, where you put in the lives of people at the foreground and data. But on that, I think there is a caveat which I must add, that I did that sort of reporting for about 2 years in Mint. When I was reporting to Niranjan, just after I finished that malnutrition stint, if you remember. And I did try to combine that data plus features. Often, there can be conflicts between what you're hearing on the ground and what you are seeing in the data set. And resolving that presents a different level of challenge. And I have spoken to researchers also who use mixed methods of researching, using quantitative and qualitative, wish to give precedence in one case. So a data journalist will always give precedence to what he or she sees in the data. A feature writer will always give precedence to what he or she sees on the ground. So that conflict will remain.
It's a related question from Mohit Rao, who's saying that, in major newspapers and media outlets, the data team works independently from beat reporters, tend to, many of whom have no inclination for numbers. And this leads to news stories with no background data context, or complex data stories with no ground context attached. So how do you ensure the importance and focus on data, even in aspects of everyday reporting in city, state, and politics? And can you do that? Or are they still separate right now?
So that is separate, but there is that problem is recognized and it is being changed. And from our part, so 2 years ago, HT and Mint did a joint workshop for data journalists, but also invited anyone else who was interested. And quite a few were. And I don't know how much the workshop helped them, but at least I hope it's got them thinking into producing different kind of stories. But increasingly, reporters are being asked to look at the data around the stories that they're doing, and increasingly they're asked to give at least one chart along with the stories. So that is already happening. We do not have an institutionalized sort of training program like, say, NYT has, and I think we should, that is something which we lag, and we should think hard about that.
So John, also again, exactly this question, but also there's a question from Siddharth Dasgupta, who's asking, does data dehumanize certain stories with the objective of fact-based reporting?
So, Samar, I'll like to answer the previous question also.
Yes, please.
There are a couple of stories we worked with the Mint team. So one of the stories is that I think with Namrata's team, a few years back on, we looked at the schools data, like 2.5 million schools are covered in the district information for school education, DICE data. So what we did is that we combined reporting and numbers. So How India Lives, we contributed in terms of scraping the data. No, that the raw data was made available to us to getting the insights from the data and then providing it to the team. And Namrata's team, they worked on actual reporting. So one of the questions that we asked from the data is that has this dropout ratio for girls who reach the puberty age decreases or increases based on the functional toilets. And so we were able to see that a school with a functional toilet were able to retain more girl students through their puberty. And it was a data that was residing there, and we shared it with Namrata, and she did a stories based on that. And so that I think it's a 3 or 4 part series. So you can data can work along with reporting. The other story that I can remember is Premit's 2-part series. The full pages he wrote on around the GDP or a PLFS crisis time, Premit. That was
GDP.
GDP, yeah. So
it was more about reporting on the data and the data generating process.
So I feel, Samar, I think we need to report on the data itself. The ministry itself, what goes behind the data. Like the assumptions behind the data, and all of that. So So one is that, like you have to work with a project like with Namrata's team on education. The other project that we worked with some other MINT team only, we worked on the FCRA data. We wanted to see what sort of societies are getting deregistered, what sort of societies are getting what sort of money, who are the donors, and all of it. So again, the data and analysis we supplied, and the reporting was done by the MINT team. So it's happening. It should happen more. And combining the two, it's very expensive. Imagine you doing the data analysis, plus on top of it, you're doing the reporting. It's very expensive to do it. And I really hope that, we have more support for newspapers and media houses, that people come and support, so that these type of work can be taken up. And second point is that, we need to report on the ministries. We need to report on the methodology. We need to go and find out what is how the data is collected. What is the problem? Why the data is not coming out like that. So that we need to capture. I agree that we have to contextualize plus humanize it, but I feel that given the limited resources, it might be very tough at this juncture.
Especially at this time when so many journalists are losing their jobs and media houses are cutting back massively. And in fact, that answers a question from Bhaskar Tripathi in our audience, who talked about the importance of footwork and whether that is receding. But you're saying obviously that all this has to be backed up by good old-fashioned beat reporting in ministries. John, there's also a quick question for you, not directly related, but to what you said about the NDMA earlier. Shirish Koyal is asking, do you think NDMA withdrew its data to save the government embarrassment, or were the data not supposed to be released in the public domain? There's a related question from Vikas Kumar, who's asking, saying that by saying that delays in the release of government data can be seen as bureaucratic procrastination, are we not overlooking the larger problem? Is it mere coincidence that delays in release of government data have been growing alongside weakening of independence of judiciary, dilution of RTI, curbs on press freedom? Pretty little broad, but if you can quickly take a stab at that.
So Samar, I feel that that's where the reporting on the data is important. We need to find out why the data was released late. We need to find out, like what Pravit was saying. I read the story, but I did not read. If Niti Aayog guys were signed the report, somebody had to dig that report and had to point out in the report to say that, boss, you have signed that report. So I feel that, as data journalists, we need to start reporting more on the aspects behind the data release, how the data is collected, the methodology and all of it. So I used to cover the statistics ministry 1 year. It's a vast ministry. And so there are different departments within the statistics ministry and all of it. And trying to understand the methodology and how they're going about doing the data, I think we need to do that more because we need to find answers. Why is that migration data for 2011 is being released in 2019 and 20? It doesn't serve any purpose. 2011 you collected the data, and you are now preparing for 2021 data, and the migration data is released on 2009. I believe that there are some tables within census 2011 has not yet been released.
Okay, sorry, you were saying something?
No, Samar, I finished my point.
Okay, I think essentially in the last 10 minutes and the questions are going on flowing in, but I think one a particular question is on the future of data journalism, and Rukmini, I'd like you to address that. What are the ethical implications of the use of artificial intelligence in data journalism? One, this comes from Aishwarya Hardikar. Do you agree that the future world is a visual one? Should we expect the development of data journalism or different types of visualization of content? I think the question is, A, of course, is pretty clear. What are the ethical implications of of AI for data journalism? And the whole question of people reading less, which I think you said you don't agree with, though I think that is substantially true, that people are reading less, their attention spans are shorter, and they're seeing more and more on the whatever little 10-second videos, etc. How do you deal with that, with the current realities and the coming age of visual visual media and artificial intelligence? Broad questions.
So I'm going to lob the artificial intelligence one straight to John and take only the second part of it.
Okay.
I actually, something that Pramit said earlier, I agree with, which is that I think when I first started doing data journalism and first, when I think newsrooms had a bit more money, say 5-6 years ago, there was a lot of focus on the visual element and on interactives. And slowly, I think, the bottom line has prevailed, and I don't think the numbers, either for most visuals or for interactives, really match up to the investment that it needs. So I think I've become more pragmatic about what visual elements are needed and what are just indulgences. Everyone would like to have a couple of these exciting interactives on their body of work, but I agree with Pramit that I think there's going to be a much more sort of pragmatic approach to using them going forward, and that might not be a bad thing. About attention spans, I believe that there's research that shows that people are reading less, and but the nature of what people are looking for, I still believe that there is a hunger for information and fact, whether or not it's information that bolsters your existing biases or not, is something journalism that will be read less of. But I don't. For example, in this pandemic right now, there is so much hunger for good, solid data and information around the epidemic. If I found, I don't track the numbers of what I write closely enough, but if I found that there was a piece that got poor numbers, I truly think that I would take it as useful criticism, because people do want numbers right now. So if there's something that made them not read what I was writing, I wouldn't assume that it was because they don't want to read or because it's numbers, or people would want something lighthearted instead. There's smart ways of getting at getting to what people want to read in an engaging and informative way. So no, I don't think any of us here would say that we've had a problem with readership, right? So I'd like to think that that telling a story well, I don't think that we are in particular danger of this attention deficit problem, I think.
Okay. So here, since you've lobbed that other question to John, we'll go to John for that. But John, I'd like to also bring in, there's a question has come to us from Gozi Kendrick in Nigeria, representing students of the Awendo Media College. So welcome all of you from Nigeria. And they have a question again related to ethics. What are the ethical issues in data journalism that greenhorns in the industry should take note of? Apart from that, of course, the question that Rukmini lobbed to you about artificial intelligence.
I'm flattered that Rukmini can think that I know much about artificial intelligence. Not so much. But I'll answer the ethical part. Samar, the way I look at data journalism, it has to stick to the basic tenets of the basic journalism, let's say. If you're using a number, you need to give the source clearly. Any reader who's looking at the story and looking at the number should be able to go back to the same source, be able to retrieve the data by themselves and verify it. To me, that is the basics of data journalism. I see a lot of stories wherein a couple of days back there was a story on number of migrants, so many districts, 45 districts. So there was no specific information on who collected it, where the data is, and all of it. So I feel that we need to give the power back to the reader to say
Are you referring to the page 1 graphic of a business newspaper? No. Okay,
no,
fine.
I think it's a general newspaper, I think.
Okay.
Yes. So, it was
you guys are talking in riddles.
No. So I've got told, I don't remember which newspaper I read, but I just the news. It's about a news article wherein the report quantify saying that X number of districts have X number of migrants population. And this was the first time one could get a consolidated view of that number, but as a reader, I should be guided to say that, hey, I got it as a source who shared the number with me, or the data is sourced from this ministry and this was the table. So I think that has to be, the power has to be with the reader to go and verify it by himself that what I'm saying in the data story is correct or not. And the second thing, we try to do it, I think Pramit also does it, is that whenever we are giving out the data, we help them to download the data that we have used in the story. Often I find only the charts and the number that is within the table, those are the only numbers that's given. I think what's wrong in it, give the entire data. So after the demonetization happened, we did a story on, so we tracked the retail prices from Big Basket in 6 cities. I know we had the same basket, and then we tried to see what is the prices of Big Basket of all this item. What we did is that we did an interactive, and also within that interactive we said that this is the data, and there are people who download the data, and there are a couple of instances where people asked us question on the Twitter saying that, hey, this data is so and so, why so? So I feel that more disclosure on where you got the data and helping the reader to access the same data, helping him as much as possible is I think the basics of data journalism. And then you have to quantify, be a devil's advocate and say that where all the data could go wrong, if quantify it, this data is limited by this, this data has the ABC limitation, and but despite that, these are the results. So I feel that more disclosure on methodology, where the source is, how did you process the data, and making the data available to people would actually create a good credibility for your stories.
Okay, we're down to the last 4 minutes. So, and I'm going to take this opportunity to again return to the same point that I was making with Rukmini earlier, because there are more questions coming in on this aspect. And this is from Namas Bhojani, who's one of India's preeminent photographers. He's asking the same thing. It is many times much faster to see and understand than read. A data chart can be much faster to understand, and it is visual and fast. So, given the fact that we are, whether all of us like it or not, going into a world where the visual medium is being adopted more and more, how are data journalists and data journalism preparing for the world ahead?
Can I just one sort of innovation that Mint has done that it doesn't answer this fully, but it's just something that I feel is a useful way of thinking about and acknowledging what the person who's asked the question has said, for example, which is something as simple as annotating charts. It helps the reader, it gives an explanation of what you're directing the reader to look at. So it brings in some of what your story was trying to say, but it's still within the context of the chart. So, if we acknowledge that there are some people who think more visually and would like to see the chart alone, we get this feedback from some editors, which is that sometimes they'd like the entire story to sort of be in a chart, which would do much better on social media than the whole story. The story might do better on their website. So, it seems like a very sort of run-of-the-mill thing to say, but I really think that well-annotated charts can sort of be that bridge between a story and just a chart to try and direct the viewer towards what, or the reader towards what you want them to be seeing in the chart. The others could have more to say about the visual direction.
The visual direction, very quickly, just one minute from both of you all. The visual direction, I want to ask you, give you a scenario, because, we are seeing this, we see holograms, we see those 360-degree things. Has there been any discussion around integrating data journalism into this, which can be an immersive experience? I certainly know there are some projects like that running in other countries. Do we have anything like that in India?
Yes, so just to add to Rukmini's point, so for the plain fact stories on a page, what we try to also ensure is we typically have 4-5 charts at least. So for a time constrained reader, if he or she just goes through the charts, at least the gist of the story from the chart headlines and annotation, they should be able to. So that's what we aim for. That's in the print context. In the digital, we present it differently. So you have the part of the text and then one chart and then so on. So that doesn't work that way. But yes, one of the things that I've liked and noticed about Reuters and South China Morning Post, which is what you were referring, is more immersive, and that's using that scroll option as a sort of interactive tool. So that will require some UX level changes. So that's where the product team and others. So there are some discussions on this. I don't know where it is headed, but yes, people are thinking about it. So how we do it and so on, we have to see. But yes, that could be one way, one new thing that you would see in the future. And just one hat tip: that idea of putting in annotations or thick annotations in charts, that actually is something we borrowed from the people over at Hindustan Times, Gurman and Harry. They taught us actually. When we learned it from their charts, and then we sort of standardized it and went with our fonts and so on.
Okay, we are unfortunately out of time, and I'm sure there's much more to say. I can see John does want to say something, as do all of us, but we are out of time. Thank you very much. This was fascinating, even for me, and as I'm sure it was for everybody else out there.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Pramit, Rukmini, John, and Samar. In the time of WhatsApp University, good data journalism is needed to provide us with credible narratives. Thank you for the insights. And thank you, audiences, for joining us today, and hope to see you at our next event. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.